Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you to the Arts Organization for hosting me. I have been so impressed with my trip here so far. I did a workshop with students today and was just delighted by the group, so passionate and present with me. It's really been a pleasure. So I'm going to hop right in. I'm starting off with a few images that I did as an undergraduate when I was doing my BFA in painting, which I did right after completing an English literature degree. And so I thought I was going to be a poet. I was in my senior graduating year with my English lit degree, and I took a painting class as a gift to myself, and it totally changed the course of my life because I realized that my true innate language is visual and that I wanted to write my poems visually. It felt more natural to me. And so one of the ways, like many young artists, that I learned how to paint is through self-portraiture, dealing with issues of identity as a young woman, and also as a way of just spending time with myself. I knew I wanted to paint the figure, but I didn't want to have a model there. I didn't want to have to think about another person. Like my own mind isn't enough. And so I started this series of self-portraits that were part of my thesis exhibit as an undergraduate. This one's called Letter to You. And so thinking of the painting as a place to face the self. And so when I say letter to you, of course it's to the self because I'm looking in the mirror, and then eventually it's a gift to a larger community. It's a letter to my community. And so that literature degree, of course, comes into because these images of the open book or the letter being written, that the canvas is a letter that I'm sending out. And so this one's called Departure, one of the last paintings that I did while I was at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. And this is a Van Eyck painting, Northern Renaissance painting, and you can see here from those last series of portraits, I was really influenced by the rich, deep colors of the Northern Renaissance. And I was also really interested in Renaissance paintings like this one and the Annunciation by Fra Angelico. I had the amazing opportunity of studying for a summer in Italy and got to see many of these firsthand. And I was very struck, and continue to be, by the way the painters would use the canvas as a stage and would create a theatrical event of the figures. And so this is an idea that weaves into my work a lot, both through painting and later you'll see through video now, and just the way that I approach the canvas in general as a theater for an event or a process to happen. And so this was my final piece for that, it's called The Annunciation, and it's a double self-portrait, and the figures are about life size. And you can see the figure on your right side has long golden ponytail, and then I actually cut those off to do the other figure. But when I was working on the figure with the red, I would actually pin the ponytails back on me. And so it was just this fun kind of character acting, again, getting at this idea of the theater of a painting. And very last painting of this time, which is a big deal for me because up until this point, I was really working mostly straight observational. I had to be looking at something that I was painting, either in the mirror or a still life in front of me. And this was a big deal painting for me. It's about 8 feet wide, where everything in the painting, except for the figures, was observation. So this was the living room I was living in, that was the view outside the window, but the figures were completely invented. And so this was kind of the beginning of me taking some leaps and being able to paint paintings that didn't reference images that are already in the world, which is very important to me because something I love about painting is that it can access imagery that has not yet been born. And so, big change. This is what graduate school looks like. This is when you take it all apart. I started making these paintings that were very pared down. This is when I really started to learn language of painting and really thinking of painting as a poem constructed of parts. And so while I had already been well versed in observational painting, now I wanted to learn how to build an image out of nothing. And so I really limited my means and very much limited my palette to basically pink and blue. The pink came to represent myself and the blue as sea or space. And so I went to graduate school at University of Washington, which was a return for me. I was living in New York at the time, but returning to the Puget Sound was returning to the place where I was born. Okay, so as a young girl, I lived in Everett, just north of Seattle, and this was a really poetic decision for me to do my graduate work there because I wanted to go and make paintings in the landscape of all the mythology and invention of what my youth was, and to face that and to see how that could be part of my story again, or how I could change it. And so I think of these as self-portraits. I think of them as little haiku poems. And so again, really getting kind of down to the nitty-gritty of how the heck do you build an image? What does shape do? What does value do? And so I was doing a lot of drawing, hundreds and hundreds of drawings and collages that were more abstracted, but in truth, always very figurative to me. I was doing this whole series of work of a kind of box-like vessel that was a boat, and then figurative shapes interacting in that. And collage was really important to me, and that's about life size, the size of the screen there for that collage. Collage was a massive breakthrough for me as an image maker because the ability to physically tear or rip something off and place it somewhere else is incredibly liberating to me. So even though in painting on a canvas I might not tear the actual canvas, I feel incredible conceptual liberty to scrape something down and move it around if it's not working. And so the physicality of being able to change something is very crucial for me. And so another collage from that time, really experimental time. And so using tape and paper very abstractly, but then also starting to really introduce and just admit my content, which was, I was doing a lot of drawings from Japanese erotic prints, and so dealing with sexuality a lot. And so this is a large painting about 8 feet wide, part of my graduate thesis exhibit called The Deluge, or The Flood. And some of my big influences of that time, again, back to the Italian Renaissance or Mannerism. This is a Pontormo painting that blows my mind. It's in Florence, and I love the pink-blue palette. I love the circular motion that is all built around the limbs of the figures guiding your body around the canvas. I'm very interested in that. And so I was also very much looking at de Kooning, who very abstractly is filling the entire picture plane with these abstract yet very figurative shapes. And so I was very interested in also his physicality, the kind of grittiness of it, and also the line between figuration and abstraction. And so this is a large painting that I did just after graduate school. It's called, it's The Big Tickler Turns into a Rain Cloud. And then I moved into a temporary studio and started to face myself in a more literal way again. So this idea of identity and self-portraiture cycles back in. Also, the idea of the lovers or using sexuality as content cycles back in. The figure in the environment cycles back in. So I think as an artist, as an image maker, other painters that I've talked to, we have a tendency to kind of really circle around a few central themes. In some ways, I felt like my whole life I've been trying to make the same painting. And so I took a spotlight and traced my profile on the wall looking through a mirror, and then cut that out and was using that as a stencil for this figure here. And then you'll see very faintly in the back there are some faces that I was thinking of as the self-portrait that I was printing onto the canvas just by rubbing with my thumb. And so this is called mira mira, the Spanish verb to look, and kind of the court gesture asking the self, which face do you choose for today? And after that temporary studio, I moved to my current studio. This is Top Hat. This is in South Seattle, and this is also where I run my private painting school. And moving to this kind of more bucolic scene in South Seattle felt like I was out in the country. And having that space, which is a converted garage, but having the studio be its own structure really has been important to me, and I think of it as like a little temple. And so just even the the rafters of the ceiling started to influence me, and so this is the first painting that I did in moving into that studio, and it's about 8 feet tall, and it's a return to the subject matter of Annunciation. So this idea of the creation out of nothing, and so the hand of Gabriel coming through the window, and the self, again, the profile, looking in the mirror, and then also referencing my own practice as an image maker and creating the stencil to replicate the image of the self. Using that stencil and that outline was actually really profound for me, because having my images both be particularly myself, but also be very flat and abstract as a painted thing was important. And so the silhouette really just hits both of those things so perfectly to me. It's very interesting. And so the idea of the shadow weaves back in, and you'll see in some of the later works, the more recent works, the shadow, the profile is very important. And this is an image I was really looking at this time. This is by Giotto. He's the grandfather of the Western Renaissance. And I've always loved his frescoes because I love these structures with the open facades where we both get a sense of being outside but get to peer within like a dollhouse. And I sort of put this in my lecture because I want to remind myself, like, I'm not done with that yet. There's a lot of work I want to do there. Love that. And alongside working on what I call my epic work, which are my big multiple figure paintings that I make, I often will have a whole nother body of work going on alongside of it that are much smaller. And so this is maybe 24 inches tall. And they tend not to include the figure as much, at least in the past, because my relationship to the figure has, for the most part, been almost one-to-one, or my figures have been almost life-size until recently. But so these smaller, quicker, more abstract paintings often say something about the content that's a lot more surprising to me than a little bit more poetic in some ways than the larger works can. And so this is called The House We Carry With Us. And I think of that blue shape in the back as the Puget Sound kind of wedged in my rib cage. And then in this current studio that I'm in, I decided to build a canvas that was as large as I could get on my wall. So this is about 14 feet wide. And this is an in-process shot of this painting where it started as this kind of interior boudoir scene. And I wanted to show it to you because I want you to see how many changes go through my paintings through the process. I really think of painting as a narrative unfolding. I don't know studies or figure things out ahead of time. Everything on a painting is figured out on the painting. Otherwise, to me, there's no point in painting. I want the painting to reveal something to me that I don't know. But so I was really not enjoying the space on that far right side. Oh, whoops, that's out of order. Well, I'll just leap into those then. There it is. And so I started to knock that space back by neutralizing all of my colors. And in mixing and neutralizing my colors, all these greens started to happen. And so to me, in my mind, the narrative I tell myself is that, oh my gosh, the grass is growing, you know? Like, it's so literal to me, or figurative, whichever one, while I'm working, that it feels so, that being in that kind of creative space feels so real that this thing is unfolding, especially when the canvas is so large that it's encompassing your whole viewpoint. And so the grass started to grow and the trees started to come in. And I realized that this was an Arcadian painting. And in classical literature, and also in painting, the Arcadia is paradise. But it is also often depicted at the moment where the recognition of the loss of paradise happens. So it is the moment in the history of human consciousness that the recognition of mortality walks in. And I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in the history of our own consciousness. And so while this kind of bucolic scene is going on, I really sense the darkness coming in through that side. And so I decided to stretch another canvas exactly the same size and hang it next to it. And unlike most of my paintings, where I usually work on the entire canvas at the same time, this one I actually hung a curtain halfway through it and just started here thinking, what would it be like for me to walk behind that curtain into that darkness? And so this is kind of a mirror image of that. And that's how that painting started to develop. And I did have some little rules for myself. I knew I wanted this painting to be a much darker palette, so darker value. I also knew that I wanted it to be completely tertiary. Those of you that were in my workshop know what I'm talking about. I didn't want it to be light, bright, or saturated. I really wanted to challenge myself and make it all earthier tones. And so this is an in-progress shot of that. And you can see that large tree there started to really bother me when I would walk into the studio. Sorry about that. When I walk into the studio, it felt like a real obstruction, like that there were different paintings going on. And so the way that I ended up solving that was, what's awesome in painting is that it's everything. It can be whatever you want it to be, that I can still hold on to that vertical, which was really important in terms of structure and design, but that I can also paint through it so that we get to see. I was always longing to see what was happening behind it. And so this painting is called Gravediggers. And this is the point of entry for me as the maker. I always thought of those as my legs. And so that's also about 14 feet across. And so some of my huge influences that are very continue to be big influences are Cezanne, and in particular his bathers. Because his bathers are where he brings his rigorous observational painting, the standing out in the landscape and responding to nature. But he's combining that knowledge with these early academic figure studies of his. And so this is this beautiful space where both observation and imagination and memory mingle. And I'm really interested in that. And I love his relationship of the figures to the environment, that some of the figures are made of the sky and some of the trees are made of the figures, and this incredible back and forth of self and exterior and person to person, and how we influence each other and how we mirror each other. And so another huge influence is Matisse. And this is one of my very favorite paintings of his, huge bathers painting, just leading up to World War I. And so this is a very intense Arcadian painting. It is pastoral, but it has the division and the darkness of the world dividing. This painting is in Chicago. And so I did a whole series of paintings of the lovers under the bower. And so a lot of lover bower scenes, a lot of this green, and a lot of color theory. Like something I've loved about painting that it has given me is an ability to really combine my rigorous intellectual side and my very, very wacko, wild, creative, sensitive side. And I really need both. I think we all do. I think a lot of us deny one or the other, but painting for me has just been so fruitful for me to be able to explore both of those sides. So for instance, this one is just 3 colors. It's cadmium yellow, a purple lake, and black. And so all of the greens are made with black and yellow, and all of the neutrals are made with the complement set yellow and violet. And I love challenges like that. Oh, it makes me crazy. And so I said I don't make studies for paintings, but sometimes I will make drawings from my paintings. So this is a drawing from that prior painting. And often I will do that because my paintings change so much in the process that it's actually a way to make a journal entry of part of a painting that tomorrow might get covered up. And so it's also a way just to re-experience and get inside of the painting. And it can solve some problems too. This is called Nymph and Satyr. And so again, cycling back around to the theme of lovers, the theme of whose body parts are whose. This is a series of in-progress shots. I love showing people a look into my own process. This is the very beginning of a painting to give you a sense of, I often start just by dividing the canvas up. And I think at this point in my process or my career, I wasn't so aware of how important the body is. I grew up as a dancer, but something that I've really been able to articulate to myself recently is how important the choreography of the body and its involvement in image building is. And so this is the starting place, just where the body is dividing that space up and seeking out its capabilities. And so then this is its next move here, moving the green into it. And then its final version, which is called Plant Life, which became, for me, this kind of allegory about these sort of more classically rendered witnesses looking into the bower at these figures that are both being deconstructed, but more to the point for me that they're being constructed. It's a positive thing, it's an additive thing. They were going towards how these figures were rendered. I had every intention of painting them that way, but I got so excited about this underpinning geometry sitting next to moves like that. It's just that this happens to be how I build a figure. Like, that stuff is underneath them too. And so that got really exciting to me to show that process. And this is another painting from that same time, same size. They're about this big. Yeah, because I can carry them like that. And this one's called Jupiter. And this is from that same series, same size. And this is called The Transformation. That figure originally was a really beautifully painted figure, like a porcelain doll. And the painting would be in my studio, and I'd be next door in my house at night, and it would really bother me that she was out there. And like, I hated her, but she was so beautiful. And I think looking back on it, the problem was that she had no relationship to her environment. She was like kind of perfectly cut out. And so I finally got the courage, and I go in, it was violent. I was butchering her and thinking, oh, I'm gonna make her like move around, or like thus like 4 different thighs. I was gonna move her around. But then the state that it's in right now, I luckily was able to leave it alone and come back into the studio and realize that that was the content of the painting. It was that need to butcher and to change and to create, which was the content. But her perfect little breast remained, and I'm happy for that. So then I had kind of a breakdown. I decided I needed to leave Europe for a while in my mind. And my mom sent me an envelope of some of my drawings from when I was 3 or 4. And I was really kind of upset and moved by them, and just felt like I haven't made anything that real since then. It really upset me. You think of the kid in the corner with their tongue out and that intensity and that concentration. And so I started to make these smaller paintings, kind of referencing that structure. These are about 24 inches tall, and there's something really important about them being smaller, and that I could hold them in my lap, and that to work on them I had to be right here, instead of the bigger paintings, which I paint like from back here, And there's something really wonderful about that. And each shape in these paintings is like tenderly, lovingly painted like 6 times. Each shape. So, the colors would shift a little bit, but they're just built so deliciously. And I needed to slow down and spend time with the object, with the surface of the painting. And so I did this series of 4 portraits. This one's called Chief. And this one's called The Warrior Princess. This one's called The Eagle Behind the Feather. And this one's called The Intuit. And so in doing these portraits, I realized I was into a new narrative. I was into unknown territory. And in some ways, these felt like these were the characters to walk into whatever this new narrative was. Then I did another small painting that's called Dystopia. And this was, in some ways, if they were the characters for this new narrative, this was the setting. And I thought of this painting as a depiction of the very last patch of grass on Earth. And these are the epics that came out of that, so the larger paintings. This one's called Growing Things in the Dark. And to me, it's like a shamanic act of, making an image. All of this kind of triangular area here used to be a fire, and then it ended up turning into plant life. And I was thinking of the whole interiors like inside of a teepee, and that this was the light kind of coming through the flaps of the teepee. And this one is called The Gift Horse.
What's it called?
The Gift Horse. There's a horse in there. There's a figure on her back with a feathered headdress. So it's a very different narrative, one that I don't totally understand yet, but I had a real feeling of intimacy with that female figure and this idea of pioneering, or what maybe would the story look like had it not been Columbus or hadn't been the European male, but that maybe had been me that encountered Native Americans first. And this one's called I Am Nature. And I think of it as a kind of Native American Athena, and so like a combination of both Western thought and American thought. And so many of you that did the workshop with me today, these are some of the fabrics we used. So I do these kind of wild setups in my studio for myself and for my students. And so this is a bower scene that I set up to use the same palette that I used with you guys today, the secondary triad. And so here are some of the studies, both in oil paint on the left and in collage, that I work from the life model once or twice a week with my students. And so working from observation remains enormously important to me. It's where I feel like my scientific mind comes at play. It's where I gather data, and then I get to play with it. And so this is another study with just an invented fire, but I was shining a warm light on the figure. And it's the same model, and I just have her move around. And then with that information on color and the secondary palette, I get really comfortable about where those different colors fall on a figure, and so I feel this real freedom with language to begin to invent. And again, this goes back to Cezanne and the figure becoming part of the landscape. This is called The Bathers. I never wanted to throw them away. I just collect them and collect them and collect them. And so I started gluing and nailing them together and created this surface to paint on. This is also something I want to return to quite a bit, this idea of the relief. But what I love about it is how difficult it makes it to make an image. Because I feel like making a really pretty image or like a nice looking figure is so easy and uninteresting to me. I'm not interested in just making an image. I'm interested in building something that has its own reality. Otherwise, photography does beautiful. Like, there needs to be a reason we're making a painting or making a sculpture. And so I really like the challenge of that three-dimensional underpinning, moving against the image. And so I started to build these three-dimensional structures.
What was the size of that piece?
It's about this big, not too big. Yeah, I want to make a huge one, though. Interesting. This is called Effigy. And then I'm going to have to start speeding up a little bit. We're almost there. And this is an ink drawing from observation, so from the model in my studio. And this is a painting where I actually used that drawing and started to paint from that drawing onto this. So I was thinking, like, how can the image travel, or where can it move? Like, can it be like a sticker or a decal, or can it be like graffiti on my own painting? This is called Heirloom. And these are plein air studies that I started to do because I was gearing up to go to Spain with some of my private students, and so I had to learn how to plein air paint because I was going to teach it, and ended up loving it. And so that combined with in-studio figurative work that I then translate, I started to build this larger painting from all of these different studies from observation. So that's a real process for me. Again, gathering data from observation and then putting it together into a bigger statement. And there's a detail from that. And then another detail. So these are all just landscapes from my backyard combined with the model in the studio. And then the final piece, which is called Arcadia Wheel. I was thinking of it as a clock. But I was also thinking of Michelangelo's Last Judgment. I really wanted to make a painting where the figures weren't stuck to the bottom of the canvas because of gravity. Like, I really wanted figures everywhere. And this was going to be the central piece for my exhibition that was coming up, and I ended up completely rejecting that painting, putting up against the wall, and this other thing was brewing. I was dealing with a lot of darkness emotionally, and this other painting started to brew, and I started to recognize it as this kind of medieval battle scene was starting to happen. And the skull appeared, and all these horses and knights, and then these other larger figures started to appear, and across the wall on the other side of the studio, this big collage was happening, and that same face from earlier, much earlier, years earlier, started to appear again. It was kind of like this horse rider, and started to appear in the painting, which I was really upset about, because I was so excited about all those small-scale marks that were happening, but this other self was coming in. It felt like this really kind of intense narrative where it's like, hey, guess what? You just set up this battlefield. Guess who has to go in there and fight? You do. And so it became this painting about the self and the self. And honestly, like, I can talk about it in such a funny way now, but it was awful. It was brutal. It was terrible. But I'm so thankful that I have painting as a place to go and to face that and to look at it. Like, I'm really thankful for that. It freaks me out that most people in the world don't. And so the way that I was able to present it to the external world, to an audience, the way I was able to deal with it emotionally, was to find a new context for it, to place it in a different context. And so I built this large altarpiece and then made smaller paintings on the side of it that were like, appeared like newspaper explanations of this. And so it was like placing this image within a kind of art historical context, or the way an image appears when you flip through an art history book, where it's not that anymore. It's not the reality of that, but rather there's a removal now, and it's that in the context of a larger span of time or community or audience now telling a narrative about it. And so that perspective, that distance has become really important to me, really interesting. How do we present images? And so this show, the title of it was Story Tell Her, like storyteller, but tell her. And it was the first show, this is a detail of one of those smaller pieces. It was the first show where I really embraced both sculptural content, but really embraced installation, really embraced thinking about my paintings within a larger context. And so this piece as a whole is called Language. And so really the story about, you know, the alphabet, the language, the chunks of wood, it's like my paintings made physical and hacked apart into parts, becoming the relief structure, starting to become an image, and then into the painting, like how that kind of physical rumbling and that need psychologically is born to create an image, to share it. This is a close-up of the image itself called Language. It's one of my favorite paintings I've ever made. And these are some other shots of that same show, Story Tell Her, in a couple of those paintings. This is called Woman, Woman, Woman. And I was thinking of hieroglyphics, thinking of the image as language. That's woman. Blue triangle plus pink triangle plus violet rectangle plus green triangle equals woman. And another image from that show. And another one from that show too. This is called Storybook, or I'm sorry, Picture Book. And then I went to Spain. And so last year, I've been doing these tours in Spain and in Portugal with my students, and they've been incredibly revelatory for me to get out of my own context, to spend time in a new place with a different type of light, to respond to that has been incredible for me creatively. I was at the base of the Montserrat mountain for a month and got to do a lot of plein air painting on my own. Each day I would pack my lunch and would hike into the mountains and do a new study. And this has just been such an extraordinary experience for me. There's something that's been really profound for me in looking outwards and letting the world project on me. Like I'm the screen and it's the, what are these called? Projectors, that the world is projecting onto my blank screen. There's something incredible for the soul and the spirit in that way, instead of whacking up against my own head in the studio. So the plein air practice has been really profound. And so I started also doing some collage. So again, the same story of like going out in the world and collecting data, and then coming back in the studio and like chunks of green are kind of the landscape, chunks of pink are my body. Okay, so I'm out there looking at the landscape, but what if my body is in the landscape? And collage seems to be my way of getting in there. This is a view of the works that I did at that time and some close-ups. This is just called Montserrat. And this is just called figurative landscape. And I think of it as a haiku. And then when I got back, I did one of my very first collaborations with a poet. And this was our piece, and it's called Documents. And he was in Brooklyn, I was in Seattle, and we were just sending letters back and forth and photographs from earlier in our friendship. And that central painting was, again, coming back from Spain and having this experience of plein air painting, was a plein air painting of the documents on my wall. And so I had the canvas and then had all of our documents hanging and just painted what was around it. And that sounds sort of like duh or silly, but it was really profound for me to be able to bring that new kind of conceptual idea of what it means to face and to plein air paint in the world, but that why can't that be on the wall of my studio? Like it was a very different feeling for me, a different way of approaching what's already around me. And this is another piece from that. It's from a text message on my iPhone sent from Andrew to me of a photograph of me on his wood table. So again, looking through different levels of presenting an image to somebody. And this is very recently when I did a self-invented residency in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, last May. Where I just had a friend of mine clear out half of his studio, and I rented half the studio and stayed there for a month. And I started building this installation out of a lot of cardboard that I was finding in the dumpsters, and just using a lot of different materials and having so much fun with it. And this is the main character that came out of it. I was thinking of it as a kind of knight or a Joan of Arc figure, and again, my hair clipping came into it, this kind of character that I then made a video from, which I don't think I have time to show you now, but it harkens back to using the silhouette. And so there was this really beautiful, intense sunlight in the late evening that would be cast onto this installation. And so I could move in front of it, and you can see my hand here. But so my body, my shadow actually got to move through and interact with that Joan of Arc sculpture. And so I've really been thinking a lot of sculpture and video as a way to embody my work. Again, coming back to that idea from the Renaissance that I love so much, of the work being a theater or a stage. And when I got back from New York, I started dyeing fabrics and thinking about painting in a different way, because after this experience of starting to use video and thinking about light in a different way, thinking about shadow and projection. And so I made little videos, little GIFs. I've gotten really into GIFs, they're so cool. Just small moving pictures that I would video these paintings I was making being blown in the wind, and so these are called moving pictures. And that led into the piece. Amy mentioned I just was a finalist for this award, the Nettie, and this was the piece that I made for the exhibition. So it's the painting, it's all the dyed fabrics, so creating this whole theater or stage that included painting and video, which is new and exciting for me. This is called Outside the Garden, Looking Inside the Garden. And these are the pieces of furniture. So I'd just go thrift shopping and find things, and if I didn't like the legs on a particular chair, I'd remove them and put different legs on them, dyed fabrics, and then also had the video component that was of me walking through a landscape. This is a video still from the video that is part of that, which relates to the image in the painting. And the very final piece in that was spontaneously the day of the opening. I took a pillowcase and cut it into a shirt and painted it and realized that, oh, the finishing part of this piece is when I show up. You know, it was just a really beautiful moment for me of recognizing what I'd been building and what that meant for me as an artist, as a maker, as a person, that I had made that for myself, and that, of course, I was the protagonist. It was really pretty profound for me. It was fantastic with my champagne. And then I'm nearing the end here of my images. I got to go to Portugal this past year, which has been amazing for me. This is my studio. And I was doing plein air paintings. It's my way of getting out into the world and feeling what's around me, and then bringing those plein air paintings back into the studio and using them, but then inventing figures inside of them. And another plein air painting here. And the little drawings are, I started to do some video work there, that I started to do drawings from the video of me walking through the landscape, and then some painted studies. Another one here. Another one here. So video has been this amazing way of drawing for me. It's a really quick way. I just use my iPhone. Really quick way of me just accessing content that I don't necessarily want to access in painting. Because again, I'm not really interested in just making an image, but video is documenting something in an interesting way. And so I stretched a sheet between a tree and a large easel. This is still in Portugal, and I started making this video of my body moving behind the sheet with the sun behind me, and just really spelled out to me so clearly where I was at with myself, that idea of composing in the rectangle, using my body to create the space of a painting. And I am going to show you this fun little video. So this was so cool. I did tons of footage, and going back and looking at the footage and deciding how I wanted to edit it, found that there was this footage where there was this cat interacting with me that I had no idea was there when I made the video. And so this has audio. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. Ah! Well, there's my recent band piece. Crazy. And so this is called Cat Dance. Sorry.
My love is a mountainside.
And then this is a screenshot from the larger shadow piece that's projected on the wall very, very slowly. So it's really abstract. You don't even know it's a figure when you first see it. But then there are moments like this where you start to recognize what it is. And again, that relates to the title, this physical memory, these different layers of remembering ourselves or each other through history, the wood versus the projected image versus the stage of this plane of reality that we meet each other on. Thank you so much for your attention.